I appreciate that merciful introduction. He was not kidding. Those of you who are here on Sunday, our Vice President for Advancement, Colleen Kennedy, generous as she is, basically used all of my limited time to introduce me, and so it was about a 5-minute lecture. It was nice. I want to begin by, first of all, thanking all of you for being here, all of the work that you do in your respective institutions and communities. I'm looking forward to getting to know you over the next 2 days. It is a great privilege for me and a joy to be here with you for these 2 days. I think the Catholics on Call program, as this is my 3rd year now on the faculty here at CTU, and I've gotten to know it a little bit here and there. In fact, it was my first 2 weeks here at CTU in 2016 when Father Steve Bevins asked if I would give the reflection at evening prayer. So if you were here 2 years ago, I was here for that. And that was my first experience of the Partners Conference. And then this summer to see all the great stuff that was going on with the young adults who are here. I'm just very moved by it. It's a one-of-a-kind resource. And so I'm grateful for all those who facilitate it and lead it, the Peter and the Steves, as they're affectionately called. And I'm especially grateful to all of you for being here. I think that the mission of the Catholics on Call program aligns obviously very well with the theme of the 15th Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops. Their theme is young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. And these topics intersect to form the mission, the core of what Catholics on Call is all about, which is why Peter and the Steves decided to select this theme, the theme of something that, as I keep joking, hasn't happened yet, to be the subject of our gathering, at least to get us thinking about the work that we do and the work that can be done. I just want to say a little bit about myself, not by way of extending in any sense Steve's introduction, but to name my social location vis-a-vis your work as partners in the Catholics on Call mission. While I've worked with young adults and I've served in campus ministry in a variety of positions in the past, and I guess to some extent do so today, I have a lot of interaction with young adults, not on a regular basis necessarily, not in a formal way, but I help out at Calvert House at the University of Chicago, and I speak to young adult groups in the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, and I guess de facto teaching here at CTU, there are some young adults, and there are some not so young adults that we have as students as well. All are welcome. I just want to identify that that's not my primary ministry or work. So it may be striking you as it struck me, well, what do I have to offer by way of leading us in some reflections, some concerns, some considerations? And I want to say that, I am a theologian and somebody whose primary encounter with young people is with those who, by and large, have discerned to embrace a call to religious life or ministry. That could be lay ecclesial ministry, religious ministry, formal ministry in the church. In other words, they've already kind of signed on to a type of vocation that the bishops of the world, and we'll be talking a lot about bishops by virtue of the synod theme, right? Basically presume vocation means. I'll have a lot more to say about that in a minute because, as you probably already know, a lot of our young adults are not comfortable with that limited notion of vocation. I'm not comfortable with that at all, and I'm sure many of you aren't either. But I want to share this because, I'm mostly interested in looking at the topics, the documents, the themes of the Synod, not only for vocation in the narrowly presented sense, but I'm particularly interested in the manner in which theological reflection is engaged and magisterial teaching is deployed. So we're here at a moment where in just 2 weeks, it's actually, I saw a countdown on Twitter, there's 13 days and so many hours before the Synod opens. And a lot has happened. And so we're in this really interesting moment where we're concerned with this by virtue of our calling. Again, partners who are mentors, who are vocation directors, who accompany young people. And then there are leaders of the worldwide church who are gathering, along with some observers, again, I'll talk about that in a moment, that are also going to raise these questions on sort of a global level. On this last point, I think there's a lot that is new in the exercise of synodality in the church. It's not new by design, and actually Father Steve would be better to talk about that than me in many ways. But it's in our own time, especially under the ministry of Pope Francis, it's new by way of a return to the original intention of what synods or a synod of bishops should have been or once was in the first place. Something that was distorted and lost, I'm afraid to say, over the last 30 years or so. And we're starting to get a glimpse of a return to its original intention. Now let's see if the technology works. But we're also in a time of rapid change. Newsflash, right? You're probably thinking, tell me something I don't know. Did you notice that 36 hours ago, there was a change with the synodal structure of the Roman Catholic Church? Okay. Yeah, most people missed it, I imagine that. Father Steve and one other person didn't. So here's the picture from the press conference. This is the General Secretary, Cardinal something or other, I can't remember his name. What's the name? Oh, it's on there. His is actually on the right, whatever it is, Cardinal something or other. It doesn't matter. The point is what he's holding up. What he's holding up is a new apostolic constitution that Pope Francis issued on Tuesday. Again, things are happening very quickly. It's the first apostolic constitution to be released, or the first kind of structure, teaching around the structure of synods since Paul VI reinstated the Synod of Bishops after the close of the Second Vatican Council. This is not a small thing. Its title is Episcopal Communion, which for the ecclesiologists and church nerds out there should, turn on a light. You should be excited by this. Ooh, this is interesting. Now, I'll just say a little bit about this because I had prepared my remarks and then this happened, and so I just have a bunch of pencils marks on here trying to remind me what I want to say about this. In a nutshell, what's significant about this is that Pope Francis has changed the rules about who can cast a vote at the synod. Previously, it had been primarily bishops. Bishops are elected or selected by the General Secretariat or by the organizing committee, to put it kind of colloquially. And then the Holy Father, who is the president of each of these synods of bishops, can appoint certain delegates. And we'll talk about that maybe in a moment as well, including our own ordinary here. Cardinal Supich was named as one of those delegates. He wasn't chosen by the General Secretariat, interestingly enough. Neither was Cardinal Tobin, who is also now one of the delegates. But what's interesting about this apostolic constitution is that in addition to bishops from around the world, leaders of religious communities, particularly men's communities, and I want to flag this because this is still an issue. This is the bad news of this constitution. The good news is that two of the participating members that were elected by what the equivalent of the worldwide CMSM is, right? The kind of union of major superiors of men, elected two religious brothers to be full participants in the synod. And under the current rules, you had to be a priest to cast a vote. And Pope Francis, as of Tuesday, changed that in anticipation of the synod, and that those two lay brothers they are equal members and voting members of the synod. So on the one hand, that's good news. On the other hand, this cardinal was asked in this press conference, well, what does this say about the women observers and women religious? And he said, well, things are the way they are right now. That's almost a verbatim quote, too, by the way. I'm very sad to say. So we can talk about that. I think it's indicative as we get started with some of the things. I talk about, as we look at our theme, hopes and challenges for the synod on young people. I see here right from the get-go, right from the beginning, 2 weeks out, both a hope and a challenge. A hope is there's a breakdown, maybe a little bit, coming from the top, coming from the president of the synod, Pope Francis, of the clerical structure, to say that you don't have to be ordained to have the same vote as a cardinal archbishop who is a delegate at the synod. And nevertheless, a challenge is, where are the women's voices? So stay tuned. This is something, by the way, that young adults are very, very concerned about. I don't need to tell you that. I love an audience that we're on the same page right away, It's always fun to rally the folks, to rouse the rabble. As long as those pitchforks and torches aren't aimed at me, we can go. So I just wanted to give a quick overview. Father Steve mentioned a little bit about the theme. Two presentations I've been invited to share with you, two sets of reflections. This is the first. It's going to be really analysis, looking at the content, the context, providing some analysis about what's happening at the synod, what's happened so far, what the background is, what we might expect. Then tomorrow morning to come back and take a look at the implications, the hopes, and some practices. Where do we go from here? And in a real way, I'm very deliberately thinking of the stuff that Mark's going to lead us on, his serious thinking and reflection and research around vocation. I anticipate that the stuff that Mark is going to lead us to reflect on and discuss really aligns well with what I'm going to share this afternoon about what young adults from around the world are saying, right? I do want to say that this presentation this afternoon, and this is dangerous, especially in this post-lunch hour, I'm going to try to stick to script. I don't oftentimes talk from notes, but as you'll see as we get going, there's absolutely so much to talk about that I need to keep myself on track. Otherwise, it'll be a total disaster, okay? And you'll be going, what is he talking about? I'll run out of time, and then you'll get the pitchforks and torches and so forth. So that's the plan, right? And you know the rest. That's on the agenda. So before we dive into the details of this current Synod of Bishops, though, I think it's a good idea to address some basic background information to ensure that we're all on the same page. See, we already saw this, right? We didn't all know what happened just 36 hours ago, right? So in order to do that, I want to address a few key issues, present a few questions. They're not rhetorical. I'm going to answer them so that at least we have a common language, a common sense, right? The first is, what the hell is a Synod of Bishops? We talk about this. Do we really know what it means? In the modern era of the Western Church, and here I'm being very deliberate, Western Church, the Roman Church, the Latin Church, because the Eastern understanding of synodality is very different. Like so many other aspects of our Eastern Christian sisters and brothers, they haven't necessarily lost some of the things we have in the West over the centuries, but that's for another time. What we're going to be talking about today and tomorrow with regard to the Synod is really what we talk about with the Roman Church. It's a gathering of bishops, representative bishops from around the world. And this is distinct from a gathering of all the bishops. That's what we call an ecumenical council. So when all the bishops of the world come together, then we have something like Vatican II or Trent or Vatican I or Nicaea. This is a representative gathering of bishops. They meet for several weeks to discuss a particular theme. And this practice is something of a restoration of the manner of theological reflection marked by communio, koinonia, fellowship, communion, collegiality from within the College of Bishops. And I think it's far more common in particular regions of the church over the centuries. So those of you who can remember your church history classes, there have been very significant synods. I think, for instance, I teach theological anthropology here. So one of the things we talk a lot about is sin and grace, right? We talk about original sin, for instance. Well, the Synod of Orange, which a lot of people have never heard of before. It's actually the second Synod of Orange, becomes very, very important. And that was a regional gathering of bishops addressing a particular theme, a theological theme in this case. This modern practice, though, of a Synod of Bishops dates back to 1965 when Paul VI, at the close of the Second Vatican Council, wishing to maintain that spirit of collaboration and collegiality that was witnessed at an ecumenical council, reestablished this as a permanent institution of the church. It was meant to meet intermittently, kind of here and there, an ad hoc sort of gathering, when the Pope felt it was necessary to address a particular issue, concern, or theme. Since 1965, there have been 14, quote, ordinary assemblies of the Synod of Bishops. Now, just to get a little technical about this for a minute. 14 so far. This will be the 15th. That's in contrast to the very rare extraordinary Synod of Bishops, which is only convened 3 times. The most recent was in 2014, when Pope Francis had the 14th Ordinary Synod of Bishops and said, we have too much to cover in one synod. The next year we're going to have an extraordinary one, back to back, right? And then occasionally there are what are called special synods, which are typically regional. So there have been special synods on Asia, special synods on Africa. The next special synod is set for next year, and the topic is the Pan-Amazon region. So a South American and Latin American topic. What are the issues pressing the church there? And you may have actually heard a little bit about that when you've heard perhaps of the conversations at the local level in places like Brazil and among the bishops about maybe the possibility of admitting, at least for now, married men to orders? Have you heard something about this? No? Oh, the internet people, come on. Anyways, it'll be very exciting, but we have to get through this synod first, right? So, as I mentioned a second ago, the person who runs the synod is the Pope. The Pope serves as the president of the Synod of Bishops, and it is the Pope who convenes the assembly, who oversees the interventions, the speeches, the presentations, and typically issues, at least since John Paul II, a teaching document, usually an apostolic exhortation after the synod is over. Oh, that's not what I wanted. The second question, how did this synod come about? Why do we have this thing? And I think, in short, the easy answer is, well, because Pope Francis wanted it. That's a quick answer. It's not entirely fully true. But if we look to what was called the preparatory document in 2017 that outlined the scope of the synod, we get a sense of why this, why now, how did this come about. Pope Francis, and the General Secretariat in his name says that the Church has decided to examine herself on how she can lead young people to recognize and accept the call to the fullness of life and love, to ask young people to help her in identifying the most effective ways to announce the good news today. By listening to young people, the Church will once again hear the Lord speaking in today's world. As in the days of Samuel and Jeremiah, young people know how to discern the signs of our times, indicated by the Spirit. Listening to their aspirations, the Church can glimpse the world which lies ahead and the paths the Church is called to follow. So the motivation for this synod theme seems to be twofold, right, from this statement. First, that some leaders in the Church, and perhaps Pope Francis himself, recognize that the numerous issues and shifts in culture and context, especially as it gets more and more rapid, have raised important questions about connecting with young women and men in the Church and the need to shift attention toward how best to serve these young sisters and brothers. But second, and this is one that I'm going to bring up over and over again as maybe something that's lacking. There is at least the indication from the outset that the synod recognizes that young people have something distinctive and something important to offer the broader Church, and therefore the Church is tasked with, quote, listening to their aspirations. Are they listening? And by they, I mean those who are the members of the synod. Stay tuned. Next question, what has happened so far? Okay. Everything formally began in October 2016 when the General Secretary of the Synod of Bishops held a press conference in Rome and announced the convening of the 15th Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, and that the theme would be young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. A few months later, in January 2017, a lengthy document called the preparatory document was released. I'll give you a little timeline here, which included an appendix with questions for young people in various geographic and social contexts. It's actually kind of cool to look at that appendix, because there you have, by regions of the world, the Americas, Africa, Southeast Asia. So there are general questions for bishops to disperse among young people, religious orders to disperse among young people that they minister with and to. But then there's a recognition of the differences in various regions around the world. So that's actually a really positive development. That hasn't always happened, right? Trying to hear of the particular signs of the times in different regions. In March of 2018, the General Secretary welcomed young people from around the world that were named and sponsored by various bishops' conferences to gather in Rome to reflect on and respond to themes in that preparatory document. And I'm sure you remember hearing stuff about this back in March, right? There were 3 U.S. Representatives that were sent. And this meeting resulted in a document authored by these diverse and international young people in what is called the final document from the pre-synodal meeting. It's a mouthful, so I'm going to call it the PSMD for the rest of this next 2 days. And then finally, in June of 2018, the General Secretariat issued a key document known in Latin as the Instrumentum Laboris, or the working document of the Synod. And it's this text that serves as the kind of conversation starter or agenda for the Synod of Bishops that will open on October 3rd. So again, about 13 days from today. My last question for us. So is everybody with me so far? Is this helping? Where we come from? What's going on? Okay. The question is, what can we expect from the synod? Okay, this is really why we're here. On the one hand, the Instrumentum Laboris provides an interesting glimpse into the opening tenor of the forthcoming synod. So we would think at first glance that reading this, admittedly, very long document, it's about as long as Laudato Si. It's got about as many paragraphs and way over 200, right? If you have a sense of that, you're like, okay, well, this is what we can generally expect. And if this were under the pastoral ministry of John Paul II, then that's basically what we would get. That's not necessarily the case right now. That's another hope I have. Because there's good things in this document, and then there's a lot of things that don't make it from what the young people say and say they need and want, and what the bishops are proposing that they talk about for 3 weeks. So the nice thing about where we are today is this, on the other hand, that I'm going to present. A lot is determined by when and how different speeches are delivered by the participating bishops or invited observers. As I mentioned already, unlike his 2 immediate predecessors, Pope Francis is keen to let real debate, real conversation, and real dialogue around pressing issues that face the church in general and young people in particular happen. He seems open to it, right? In his letter to young people discussing the forthcoming synod before they gathered in March, he said the following, encouraging them. He said, "Do not be afraid to listen to the Spirit who proposes bold choices. Do not delay when your conscience asks you to take risks in following the Master. The church also wishes to listen to your voice, your sensitivities, and your faith, even your doubts and your criticisms. Make your voice heard. Let it resonate in communities and let it be heard by your shepherd of souls." And then he makes this reference to the rule of Benedict. Benedict says that all abbots should consult even the young monks, even the novices, before any important decision is made because, quote, "the Lord often reveals to the younger what is best." So that was Pope Francis's serious invite to young people, and they took it up. The unpredictable and creative working of the Holy Spirit notwithstanding, the purpose of my presentations today and tomorrow is to help us explore what has been done, what remains, and what is likely to be done, and where we might go from here with regard to the Synod on young people, particularly in our ministries, in the work that we do, especially with young adults. Although the event we're discussing hasn't happened yet, as I mentioned, it starts on October 3rd, we have 2 very important documents worthy of careful consideration. So what forms the kind of grounding for what I'd like to share with you? Well, the first is that post-synodal meeting final document, or, as I'm calling it, the PSMD for short. While not in a, quote, official teaching document of the church in the magisterial sense, and I should say technically, none of the documents that have been published, that have been released so far, are technically magisterial teaching, right? They're guiding documents, they're resources, they're input kind of things. Usually anything that would be of ordinary exercise of ordinary magisterium, like an apostolic exhortation, will come after the fact and would come from Pope Francis. This pre-synodal document, though, provides us with a vision and with questions that arise straight from the hearts of young women and men from around the world, drawing from their own experiences and the experiences relayed to them, especially by way of social media and other international surveys, and they're brought together cogently in their in-person meeting earlier this spring. It's worth noting, just a few statistics. In March, there were right around 300 young women and men who were invited to come to Rome to meet in person. And they were nominated by respective bishop conferences and religious orders. But they also had this responsibility as delegates sent there to kind of facilitate a Facebook group or a series of Facebook groups based on language groups. And by the Vatican's estimation, there were 15,000 participants, young women and men from around the world, who offered some kind of input. So the document, this PSMD, is reflective of, I think, a good sampling, both worldwide and in terms of various language groups. It's also important to realize that the young people who were invited to comment weren't all gung-ho, rah-rah practicing Catholics. There were men and women of other religious traditions that were invited. There were even those who identified as not belonging to a tradition or identifying as atheists that were invited. And so there's an interesting mix of input that goes in here. I think the intention was really to see what is pressing young adults today, right? The second document is the Instrumentum Laboris, which is the kind of schematic for that nearly month-long meeting. And I already explained basically what that is, so I won't say more about it. Man, boy, do these pictures look different, don't they? I mean, you look at the young people, the diversity there, and then you look at, oh, how awkward, we all wore the same thing to work. So what I'd like to do first is really begin with the PSMD and highlight a couple recurring key themes and encourage you when you return to your work places of ministry and so forth, or retire for the evening and you're looking for some stimulating bedtime reading to look it up online. It ends up being about 13 pages. It's not super long, but it's incredibly dense and rich. I have to say that after Pope Francis's recent exhortation on holiness, rejoice and be glad, this is by far one of the most refreshing, eloquent, direct, and inspiring and challenging documents I've seen coming from the Catholic Church in a long time. It's really it's energizing and inspiring. It's written by the young adults, as I mentioned, consisting of 300 representatives from 20 language groups, and it reflects the shared experiences of young Catholics and non-Catholics from around the globe, while also consciously recognizing and celebrating each person's diversity in particular social, cultural, and familial contexts. The nice thing about bringing all these young people from around the world together is that, and I should say too, when we say young people, what do we mean? I do not qualify anymore as a young person according to this standard. The Vatican set out roughly the age 16 to 29. So if you're over 30, it's like they said in the 60s, we can't be trusted. So they really got a sense of the perspectives of young adults. It's organized into three major sections that largely follow the threefold structure of the 2017 preparatory document, but though they don't keep the same headings. They are the challenges and opportunities of young people in the world today, again, speaking in kind of collective first person. The second is faith and vocation, discernment and accompaniment, which is addressing sort of the theme of the synod more broadly. And then finally, this third section, which we'll talk more about tomorrow morning, is the church's formative and pastoral activity. Here, in 5 subsections, the young adults provide their challenges, their proposals, their suggestions for action. And I find it very inspiring. Each of the 3 major headings then consists of these subheads, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to follow these 3 headings and offer some summary and an analysis of the key themes in each area. Does that sound good to everybody? It doesn't matter, we're going to do it anyway. So the first is, again, the challenges and opportunities of young people in the world today. One of the biggest themes that surfaces throughout the whole document, it comes up over and over and over again, is the desire of young adults to find, and I quote, communities that are supportive, uplifting, authentic, and accessible, communities that empower them, end quote. While the young adults recognize that family structures may vary by content and region and society, there's a general sense of a global weakening of the local family structure. As such, the church is seen by many as both a community that has the potential to respond to young adults' need for belonging, while also advocating on behalf of and supporting in meaningful ways families, as diverse as these families may be, and the young adults are quick to name that. It's not one idea of what a family is. It's striking how honest and direct the authors of the PSMD are with their criticisms and challenges to the leaders of the church. They're respectful, right? This isn't a complaining document by any means. I don't want to give you that impression. For example, they write, the church, and I quote, the church oftentimes appears as too severe and is often associated with excessive moralism. Sometimes in the church, they go on, it is hard to overcome the logic of, quote, it has always been done this way, end quote. They continue, we need a church that is welcoming and merciful, which appreciates its roots in patrimony and which loves everyone, even those who are not following the perceived standards. The authors then acknowledge that many young women and men leave the, quote, institutional church in order to dedicate themselves to other communities in which they detect a sense of belonging and meaning-making. And I think this is really important for leaders in the church and for those of us who work with young adults to be reminded of. I think there's an easy way to write off young people and say, well, they're not going to Mass on Sunday, they're not coming to my campus ministry event, they're not coming to Catholics on Call, therefore they're a bunch of disaffected, disinterested, indifferent heathens. And what they themselves have said is, no. We don't find the meaning-making, the empowerment, the community, the support, the mercy that we're searching for. And so we're going to go on a quest to find a group where we can get that. In a truly Franciscan manner, and here I don't mean like me, I mean as in Pope Francis, Franciscan, young adults talk about the church they not only want. This isn't like a list of, wouldn't it be nice that if we had a cotton candy machine every Sunday at Mass? You know? But they talk about the church they so desperately need. And I think that should be the starting point. As we listen to what they're saying, it's not that, oh, isn't this a top 10 list of interesting things? They talk about what they need. They write, and I quote, "We need inclusion, welcome, mercy, and tenderness from the church, both as an institution and as a community of faith." I think it's worth noting here that claims by a minority of ecclesiastical leaders and anonymous young adults, in both cases, I think of, and well, this is a very public thing. I don't mean to just call out names, but representative of this group would be somebody like Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia. And you may recall, you may have seen that he published in lieu of his column in the Philadelphia Catholic newspaper one week a letter written by an anonymous young adult. And if you don't know what I mean, you can read that tonight too. See what I mean? In contrast to that, I would say it's a minority view from the way the young adults are talking. The consensus of these young adults is not a vision of church that demands we need a superego, like an extra father or mother who is going to spank us, who is going to call us to task, who's going to ground us when we mess up. That's what makes these young adults today so in love with somebody like Pope Francis and his message, because his message is the gospel of mercy. They do not seek a stricter, more elite, reactionary, or otherwise static community of faith. And I think in this age of digital communication and social media and kind of echo chamber, a small group of people can have a lot of influence. And what I think is really important about this document is that it is a global solicitation of what women and men 16 to 29 around the world think. That's important. Instead, they see a dynamic institution and leadership that celebrates multiculturalism and diversity while bringing together all women and men in the spirit of the shared baptismal call they have received. The authors of the PSMD challenge or describe the challenges young people face in the future. Not just now. They say that, and I quote, "Young people seek to engage with and address the social justice issues of our time. We seek," they continue to write, "the opportunity to work towards building a better world." In this regard, they name Catholic social teaching. I think this would be news to that anonymous young adult that Archbishop Chaput put forward, right? They name Catholic social teaching as a resource and a guide for putting their faith into action and making the tradition they love and desire to participate in relevant for the contemporary world. Among other challenges, technology and social media are highlighted, not surprisingly. They name this. They say this is a real challenge for us today. They acknowledge as well with clarity the certain benefits these advances provide for community building, solidarity, and evangelization. They say to the bishops, this is not an optional thing. It echoes actually something Benedict XVI said back in 2009 on his address on World Communication Day. He said, we need to bring the gospel to the, quote, digital continent, because that's where people are. And if we're called to be missionary disciples to go into the world, we got to be online as well. It's a rough territory, let's be honest. And the young adults recognize that. They also express a sober awareness of the shadow side of that technology. It is in the last subsection of this first heading that reads as especially relevant for the church in the United States in the wake of the renewed attention to the sexual abuse and cover-ups in Pennsylvania and beyond that we've seen this summer. This document makes an important distinction about many young adults the world over that is typically lost by religious leaders. Namely, that in the understandable loss of trust in institutions and the disaffiliation of so many young people from organized religion, many young adults nevertheless remain people of deep personal faith and hunger for spiritual nourishment. They say, we may not want to identify for now with the institution of the church, but it's not that we don't want to relate to God or to one another. They are far from apathetic or indifferent to the voice of the Holy Spirit. Instead, one of their other key rallying cries throughout the PSMD is, and this is the biggest takeaway, the most repeated word, authenticity. And today's young adults have, as they express here, and I think we see even in our context here in the United States, whether it's in civil politics or whatnot, today's young adults have absolutely no patience for unsupported claims to moral authority and discourse that even hints at a kind of inauthenticity. They write, and I'll quote them, "Scandals attributed to the church, both real and perceived, affect the confidence of young people in the church and in the traditional institutions for which she stands." Another thing they bring up, it's clear that today's young adults are seeking greater clarity and accountability about the role of women in church and society. And here I want to quote them again at length. They say, "Today there is a general problem in society in that women are still not given an equal place. This is also true in the church. There are great examples of women serving in consecrated religious communities and in lay leadership roles, many of which are here right now." Right? They didn't say that, I'm adding that. They say, "However, for some young women, these examples are not always visible. One key question arises from these reflections they're writing. They say, what are the places where women can flourish within the church and society? The church can approach these problems with real discussion and open-mindedness to different ideas and experiences," end quote. Now, I'm going to jump the gun here because I'm going to talk more about this in a few minutes. This is a message that does not show up strongly in the Instrumentum Laboris. Spoiler. They do not propose anything concretely, and I think that's important, right? Whether you are for or against the admission of women to holy orders, that's usually where people jump to. You know, these young people, they just want to ordain women. They're not proposing anything. They're challenging the leadership of the church, the present leadership of the church, to acknowledge the inequality and the injustices that are gender-related, both in the church and in broader society. That's what their challenge is, right? They're not proposing or presuming to know what's best, but they do want a voice in the conversation. Instead, their respective challenge is to give an account of ecclesial society in which we all participate and which clearly remains unequal in terms of gender. You know, the phrase that comes to mind is they're calling in the spirit of authenticity with respect, right, and with appreciation for the gifts of the church and of its leaders. They're challenging the bishops and all the rest of us, lay and ordained, to say, you must give an account of yourself. Why is it this way? And because it's always been this way is not satisfying. They close this section of the PSMD naming a series of, quote, controversial issues. That's their qualifier. And they list the issues: contraception, abortion, homosexuality, cohabitation, marriage, and how the priesthood is perceived in different realities in the church, end quote. They seek clear, merciful, pastoral responses, but also desire clarity in understanding better the internal logic of church teaching around these and other subjects. Again, echoing the spirit of Pope Francis's 2013 interview, the PSMD bears witness to the fact that young adults are not looking for a juridically minded, strict, disciplinarian institution instead of leaders, but instead desires, quote, and this is their words, authentic witnesses, men and women who vibrantly express their faith and relationship with Jesus while encouraging others to approach, meet, and fall in love with Jesus themselves, end quote. They're talking to you. You don't have to wear a pointy hat to be the receiver of this message. Right? The lack of blind faith in institutions, including religious ones, whose leadership offers arguments that come across as shallowly based on a sense of unquestionable authority, challenges those who seek to promote the church and reform it in such a way as to preach the gospel of love and hospitality, to take seriously the need to risk appearing vulnerable in order to actually become authentic. Tied with authenticity, the young people mention vulnerability. Young adults are seeking such communities of meaning-making. They're looking for places to belong that empower them to live the gospel in the world, but they need, they say, leadership, mentorship, and accompaniment from those who can meaningfully address the traditionally controversial subjects like sexuality and gender in pastoral and approachable ways. Again, they're not coming with ready-made answers. They're just saying, and I'll be frank about it, they're just saying, get with the program. We are not, there's an interesting turn of phrase in the Instrumentum Laboris. The most explicit reference to these kinds of, quote, controversial subjects that the young adults talk about is in the Instrumentum Laboris, there's a reference to the fact that young adults today talk about sexuality and gender and inequality without taboo. And that's exactly what they're saying is, let's not pretend like this isn't real. Let's not pretend like this is not a reality. Young adults are not, by and large, by their own witness here, are not uncomfortable acknowledging diversity and complexity and inequality in the world. And so their challenge to the leaders of the church and to their mentors, right, partners for Catholics on Call, for instance, is that we accompany them in such a way that it's not uncomfortable or taboo or weird for us either. Makes sense, doesn't it? Everybody with me still? You're doing all right. Post-lunch Sloan. All right, here we go. The second section, right? Faith and vocation, discernment, and accompaniment. The overarching theme in this second section is the need for authenticity, transparency, and support. All right. Addressing the disconnect between missionary discipleship or gospel living and the general perception of the Catholic Church, the document states, and I quote, "For some young people, the church has developed a culture which focuses heavily on members engaging with the institutional aspect of the church, not the person of Christ. Other young people," they go on, "view religious leaders as disconnected and more focused on administration than community building, and still others see the church as completely irrelevant. It can seem that the church forgets that the people," and they italicize the emphasis, "the people are the church, not the building," end quote. That's Theology 101 taught right back to the bishops and to us, right? They recognize that this is not an absolutely universal phenomenon, but that this widely experienced reality leads to young people feeling, and I quote them again, disconnected from the church, and they leave it after experiencing indifference, judgment, and rejection. A major part of the problem is the lack of willingness for current church leaders to share authority and leadership with young people. And I'm going to quote them at length again. They say, "On many occasions, young people have difficulty finding a space in the church where they can actively participate and lead. Young people interpret their experience of the church as one where they are considered too young and too inexperienced to lead or make decisions, as they would only make mistakes. There is a need," they say, "for trust in young people to lead and to be protagonists of their own spiritual journey. This is not just to imitate their elders, but to really take ownership of their mission and responsibility lived out well," end quote. I think those of us who've worked in or are working in campus ministry, especially if you've accompanied young people for 4 years, and you know senior year's coming, and you know they're going to graduate and leave a place where they had leadership and input, and they were true ministers of the church. They're going to go out to parish so-and-so in suburb such and such, and they are going to experience exactly what these young adults are saying. You're too young, you're too inexperienced, you're going to make mistakes, this is how we've always done it. And the young adults of the world are saying, we are ready. Furthermore, young adults seek authenticity in leadership, even when that means admitting that the church collectively or individual leaders respectively get something wrong or make a mistake. They write, Young people express a desire to see a church that is a living testimony to what it teaches and witnesses to authenticity on the path to holiness, which includes acknowledging mistakes and asking for forgiveness. They wrote this in March, and think about how relevant it is now. They continue. Young people expect leaders of the church, ordained, religious, and lay, to be the strongest example of this, knowing that models of faith are authentic and vulnerable, allows young people to freely be authentic and vulnerable themselves. Again, the young adults note that it's especially difficult for young women in the church to feel a sense of belonging or to imagine a place of leadership in the church, given the lack of clarity around the role of women in the church, the mixed messages they perceive. Sometimes not so mixed messages. This is a persistent issue, as I mentioned, raised in all three sections of this document. One section of this, under this heading, is, I think, of particular importance to Catholics on Call partners. It's in subsection 10, if you want to go look it up after. And it's titled Young People and Accompaniment. Here, these young adults, the authors of this document, relate that young adults are seeking mentors that acknowledge the humanity, the frailty and strengths, the successes and failures that they, that is, you and me, are not perfect people, but forgiven sinners. That's their phrase. That we are not perfect people, but we are forgiven sinners. I'm reminded again of Pope Francis's first public interview. Remember, in English was published in American Magazine in September of 2013. The first question asked, who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio? And his answer is what? I am a sinner. They outline some samples of qualities they seek in their mentors, in their partners. They say, and I quote, qualities of such a mentor include a faithful Christian who engages the church and the world, someone who constantly seeks holiness, is confident without judgment, actively listens to the needs of young people and responds in kind, is deeply loving and self-aware, acknowledges their limits, and knows the joys and sorrows of the spiritual journey. They are seeking mentors who are empowering, not treating them as passive followers. That comes up a lot. They feel like when they're out in ministry, they go out to be participants in the church, they're just told to follow, not just by priests or pastors or bishops, but by lay women and men too. You know, think about all the music directors and choir directors out there. When some new college student comes into town and has a different idea about what we should do for midnight mass, oh my God, heaven help them. They are seeking then, colleagues with whom you are walking side by side. And I think this is something that's really important. And I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, and this is really geared toward our ecclesiastical leaders as well, but it's us too. They name us as well, right? Lay, women, and men as well. By virtue of our baptism, the time served in the church means nothing. By virtue of our baptism, you are as much a Christian as the Pope is, as the local cardinal is, as the associate pastor is, as Sister Kathleen is. The key is all of us are equal members of the body of Christ. Paul makes that clear, doesn't he? You can't say I'm an eye and I'm better than a foot, and I'm a hand and I'm better than a nose. He says we all are diverse, we have different gifts, different challenges, different talents, but we are one body of equal dignity. This mentorship then is not for clergy and religious alone, as I say, but young adults desire and need lay models of Christian discipleship and ministry that fit these qualities too. So as we're seeing, all of a sudden, I began by talking about the history of synods. Yeah, it's all about bishops, this kind of stuff, but they're speaking to us as well. So I hope that's one of the takeaways, is that, we don't ignore them and say, well, this is for the bishops to listen to. Sit on the sidelines and go, yeah, you tell them, kids. They're talking to us. I can call them kids because they're under 30 now. The last section here of the PSMD consists of practical recommendations the young adults present to the synod, all of which stem from the opening sentence of this section. The opening sentence says it all. They say, today's young people are longing for an authentic church, period. It's striking how direct that statement is, implying as it does that what the church is currently in the eyes of many young people is at least somewhat inauthentic. And I'm going to return to this section in greater detail tomorrow morning, when we look at the question of implications, hopes, and some practical dimensions arising from the synod and the process leading up to it. But for now, before switching gears to take a look at the Instrumentum Laboris, I just want to highlight the recurring themes just to kind of give us a list. This is what comes up most strikingly, most repetitiously as central. Authenticity, community, a sense of belonging, place of women in church and society, pastoral responses to and clarity about controversial issues, participation now in church leadership, and the desire for leaders and mentors who are human, who admit mistakes, who seek forgiveness. Let's take a look at the Instrumentum Laboris for a moment. I want to talk about that. Given that the Synod of Bishops is focused on young people as its primary mission, the lens through which I wish to analyze then the Instrumentum Laboris, to break it down for us, is the reception and integration of what I've been calling that PSMD. How have the insights, the challenges, the concrete feedback that young adults, at the request of the Holy Father, who's told them, be challenging, follow your conscience, listen to the Holy Spirit, be honest with us, which they did, how has that been received in setting the tone and agenda for the meeting of bishops 13 days from now? So in order to do this in a constructive way, with my limited amount of time, I'm going to limit the primary analysis of the Instrumentum Laboris to the first 2 of 3 sections, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But the main reason is because the third section lends itself to insights about possible concrete outcomes and implications, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow morning. Okay. The structure of the Instrumentum Laboris is, surprise, surprise, threefold. It's a very Catholic, very actually Bonaventurian thing, so if you're a Franciscan theologian, whew. It's designed in the spirit of what's called this discernment process Pope Francis lays out in Evangelii Gaudium, in paragraph 51. It consists of 3 stages: recognizing, interpreting, and choosing. So, this is where I think some of us at our table were joking about Jesuits a moment ago, as is typically our want. I went to a Jesuit university for grad school, so I can say this kind of stuff. And in fact, Steve was so overwhelmed by it that he thought my province actually lived at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester when he introduced me a moment ago instead of Holy Name Province, which, as a side note, the Holy Name of Jesus, a devotion popularized in the 15th century by Bernardine of Siena, the logo of which the Society of Jesus stole as its own logo, the IHS, that's ours. Anyway, moving on. Who's bitter? This 3-part approach evokes the Catholic social teaching process, and it might ring a bell to you, of see, judge, and act, right? It goes back to John the 23rd's Mater et Magistra. It's adopted for the purpose of the Synod's work, and it's described from the outset that recognizing is the necessary first step of looking and listening, which, as the document states, requires paying attention to the real situation of today's young people in the diverse circumstances and contexts they live in. It's right at the outset. The document explains that by interpreting, we understand it here as making sense of what was recognized according to a reference framework informed by, quote, biblical, anthropological, and theological categories that are expressed in the Synod's keywords. I don't know where Synod I think this is the first time, is that right, Steve, where Synods of Bishops have keywords like an online article or blog post? This is the first I've ever seen it, but they came up with this thing and they said, our keywords are youth, vocation, vocational discernment, and spiritual accompaniment. Okay. And then they say choosing is understood in terms of that process of determining what praxis to pursue, what concrete actions must take place. So it is kind of a see, judge, act model in a way, right? The Instrumentum Laboris explains in the beginning that in this third phase of discernment, we need to examine pastoral approaches and practices and cultivate the inner freedom that enables us to choose those that better allow us to reach our goals and discard those that are less effective. This step will allow us to identify where reforms are needed, as well as changes to ecclesial and pastoral practices that otherwise might become fossilized. That's in paragraph 3. And I have to be honest with you, when I read that, I thought, this is going to be good. That sounds good. We're going to listen to the young adults, right? That's the recognizing. We're going to interpret it according to theology, according to the Bible, according to anthropology, and then we're going to choose how to act, and our priority is going to be determining what reforms are needed, what changes to ecclesial and pastoral practices that otherwise might become fossilized. That sounds really exciting. And as Father Steve said as we were talking about this months ago, you had a line that I know you shared in another lecture, where if they actually followed this, wow, it would be a game changer. We'll see. I'm sorry to be so cynical, but I'm going to explain why. Back to the Instrumentum Laboris. This last stage of the Synod's intended path of discernment immediately inspires enthusiasm and optimism. But given its implicative, hopeful, and practical dimensions, I'm going to save it for tomorrow. For now, let's take a look at how this document does or does not receive and incorporate what the intentional gathering of young adults presented in the PSMD, what they put forward. So first, I think it's worth noting that in a purely quantifiable way, the Instrumentum Laboris appears to make every effort to incorporate things from the young adults. In its 214-paragraph size, it mentions the pre-synodal meeting final document, the PSMD, 126 times. It is by far the most quoted thing, next to, or maybe close behind, a divergent yet anonymous series of bishops' conferences reports. The way that the document presents it is, as this bishops' conference says, but they don't ever mention, is it New Zealand, is it USCCB, is it Wales and England? They don't say. But the fact is, they do incorporate a number of reports from bishops' conferences, too, from around the world. So that's, I think, hopeful. The first section, that recognizing section, I think is a little bit self-congratulatory right out the gate. The subheading of the section is titled, quote, Listening to Reality, which again is very hopeful, honestly. It's sincerely hopeful. But I need to be upfront with you. I have, and this is the challenges part of the reflections, right? I have my doubts about how well the Synod Committee has listened to the, quote, reality of many young adults, particularly around bold and challenging themes. It's not that they don't listen at all, it's just that there's selective listening. What's refreshing is the contextual starting point that grounds the document. This is hopeful to me. You know, the Instrumentum Laboris names the realities of a multifaceted variety of contexts and recognizes globalization as a major influence, major reality. Attention is given to the way these realities affect young people differently depending on their social location, their identities, and geographic locations. Globalization affects those of us in the United States very differently than it does in El Salvador, as many of us know already. And this document acknowledges that. These insights appear to come more, though, from the feedback provided by international bishops' conferences, because it was something, while briefly acknowledged, that did not play a big role. The young adults, they presuppose a diversity, right? They presuppose a pluralism. But it's still an important thing to take for granted, right? Or to include. The first section of the document advances a primary focus on the struggles and challenges young adults face in identity formation, community belonging, and vocational discernment. When the young adults in the PSMD touch on these themes, it appears in the Instrumentum Laboris. So they have actually large quotes that include things like the young adults feeling that that church leaders do not treat young adults like adults and instead interact with them as like passive followers or with passive expectations. These kinds of insights include things like recognizing the need to address mental health concerns. This is something the young adults mention and something the bishops respond to. Back in June, I was giving some talks in Wellington, New Zealand. And one morning at the hotel at this conference, the bishop of, not Auckland, not Wellington. It's on the North Island, but I can't remember there's two more dioceses. Christchurch, wrong island. Yeah, no, it's okay, good guess. It doesn't matter. One of the bishops, who is one of the New Zealand delegates, the participating delegates in the Synod of Bishops, invited me over to have breakfast, and I was there with a number of his chancery staff, and we were talking about the upcoming synod, and one of the things he said was, we performed a lot of listening sessions with young adults. That's how we wanted to solicit feedback. And he said, the one thing I kept hearing over and over and over again is the main struggle that young adults, for them it was 18 to 30, 35, was mental health issues. That it's still stigmatized, suicide is an issue, the way that women and men are handling anxiety, especially in a rapid digital age. And so he was very convicted, and it really moved me to hear him talk about his commitment to making sure that mental health becomes something that's addressed at the Synod. So there is lots to be hopeful for here. There's lots of optimism. One of the things that is maybe a challenge, though, to a side of this is that there's no social scientific grounding in the Instrumentum Laboris to acknowledge the role of structures and institutions that contribute or aggravate such suffering, including the church itself at times. This also, the things that come up that are incorporated includes things like the concerns that young adults have about the church that advocates on behalf of social justice issues, including discrimination of all kinds. The document acknowledges that. In a notable list, though, only mentioned in passing, the working document does name the truth that today's young adults are deeply concerned about inequality and discrimination because, among other markers, of gender and sexual orientation. But in the same section in which those forms of inequality and discrimination are identified, do we also find minimal acknowledgement of the young adults' frequent and direct questioning of the role of women in the church. So it's in passing that issues of the church's understanding, acknowledgement, engagement with the diversity of gender identity and sexual orientation, while they do acknowledge that kind of quickly, curiously dropped out of the reflection on the agenda is the role of women in the church. This leads me to highlight 3 areas where I think the Instrumentum Laboris really falls short in outlining an agenda that truly listens to the challenging reality of young people today. And I'm not doing this just to pick on the Synod. I'll say that this does not mean that they won't bring it up. It's just what we know right now. But I'm also bringing it up constructively because let us not fall into the same trap of not hearing our sisters and brothers that are young. First, with regard to women in the church and society, this is one of the most named issues in the PSMD. The young adults talked about gender inequality frequently and raised their concerns about the double bind of being not just a young person in the church, but the challenge of finding a home as a young woman in the church. The Instrumentum Laboris shies away from this question almost altogether. My sense is that this is a subject that is still deeply uncomfortable for the all-male leadership of the church to address head-on. I think we just need to name it in the spirit of the young adults who are bold enough to do just that. It belies the ingrained patriarchal challenges and structural misogyny that the young adults respectfully gesture toward and challenge the bishops to address. They're being respectful. That it is not a more prominent item at this point, going into the Synod, I find deeply disappointing. The second item, with regard to the desire the young adults expressed for a self-aware and honestly self-critical, reflective, and mistake-admitting leadership in the church, there is absolute silence on the part of the Instrumentum Laboris. Granted, this was released before the latest wave of clergy sexual abuse revelations, but there are several mentions of the real and perceived scandals in the church that contribute to the disaffiliation of young adults from Christianity. Nevertheless, the young adults state clearly and directed that they want bishops, they want clergy, they want men and women religious, they want lay leaders in the church who do not shy away from admitting and embracing their full humanity, including when they've made mistakes and need to repent. The silence on this subject here is deafening in the fall of 2018. Thirdly, while there's a franker acknowledgement than most Vatican working documents of the need for bishops to discuss, quote, sexual questions in a more, quote, open and unbiased way, their language, which is certainly an optimistic sign, that's good. Yet, the PSMD is incredibly nuanced. The young adults are nuanced in its naming of the proverbial cultural and ecclesial elephant in the room. What is called in these documents, quote, controversial issues. I think this is code for LGBTQ concerns, for gender issues, for racism, and so on. The PSMD, that is the young adults document, states that there is a range of responses that young people have to these issues, from outright rejection of the church's perceived teaching on the one hand to absolute uncritical defense of it on the other. The young adults say this, and that's what you would get when you have perspectives that are so diverse, and you listen honestly to what they have to say from around the world. The view, for instance, of a young man from Ghana may not be the same view as a young woman from the United Kingdom, right? So what they propose is that in all cases, that there is, regardless of where young people might fall at this moment in their understanding or response to real or perceived church teaching, there's a genuine desire for young adults to remain connected to the church, no matter what, and they wish to receive welcome, mercy, and hospitality regardless of their views. In turn, the Instrumentum Laboris picks up only on the statements pertaining to those young adults who are in lockstep with the current articulation or perception of church teaching on so-called controversial issues. There does not seem to be acknowledgement in the working document about the fact that there are many young adults who wish to still be part of the church, to still be connected, and to receive hospitality and welcome, who have strong disagreement with the way that the church's teachings are articulated or perceived. And again, I find that deeply disappointing. It's a challenge. I think it's worth noting that there is still an opportunity for participating bishops and others with a voting voice in the synod to intervene and make their remarks and discussions inclusive of these and other pressing issues that were not initially included. After all, the primary thrust of the PSMD was a call for a more authentic, relational, and justice-oriented church, which the Instrumentum Laboris does acknowledge near the end of Part 1. However, the question does remain: does what the young adult population seek in this call for authenticity, relationality, and justice align with what the bishops think or want? It's an honest question, which is why I wanted to look at these two documents side by side before us. The second section of the working document is much more didactic than it is receptive or analytical. The section is focused on interpreting, but somewhat awkwardly limits the interpretation of what was recognized in Part 1 to what is described as faith and vocational discernment. Is the Holy Spirit calling us? Just checking. Okay. But what's exclusively, instead of talking about faith or some of these other issues that the young adults bring up, they talk mostly about vocation and vocational discernment. The only faith component is in the first chapter of the section, which is a weird section. It's a string of biblical vignettes that appears to romanticize or essentialize the experience of youth and being a young adult. It is a rare part of the document that includes absolutely zero references to either the PSMD or any bishop conference report. It's just, I think somebody was tasked with, well, we need 10 paragraphs of all the times in the Old Testament that kids are mentioned. I don't know really what purpose it serves. The positive aspects, though, of this broader section include the clear agenda item of clarifying the meaning of vocation. And this is where I think I'm looking forward very much to our conversation tomorrow morning, and especially Mark's contributions. The Instrumentum Laboris acknowledges what the young adult report presents, that vocation is often too restrictive and applied only to a select few states of life in the church, mostly clergy and religious. And let's be honest, mostly clergy. When's the last time you heard at an intercession in a local parish a prayer for an increase of vocations to lay brothers or something like that, religious brothers? It appears that the synod is geared to address the idea of vocation in a broader context, but we'll have to wait and see. That's a major contribution in its own right. Another positive dimension of this section is the discussion around vocational discernment, that it's an ongoing, lifelong process rooted in baptism and essentially missionary in character. This is good stuff. All right. The document explains, and I quote, "We cannot forget that every vocational path, being deeply rooted in the experience of divine filiation given to us in baptism, is a paschal journey that implies our commitment to self-denial and to losing our life in order to receive it back renewed. Furthermore, it is not possible to fully understand the meaning of our baptismal vocation if we do not think of it as inherently connected to the church's missionary character, which is ultimately directed toward communion with God and among all people. In truth," it continues, "the different ecclesial vocations are the many multifaceted expressions through which the church fulfills her call to be a real sign of the gospel, received in a fraternal, and sororal community. The various forms in which we can follow Christ express, each in its own way, the mission to bear witness to the Jesus event, in which every man and woman finds salvation." So I think there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of promise there in terms of what the synod is going to do in trying to clarify and expand the notion of vocation. That's good, that's hopeful. In short, there is much here to be excited and energized about in the coming weeks. However, as one might expect and was seen in the back-to-back synods on the family, what originally appears in the preparatory documents, and in this case the PSMD composed by that international gathering of young people, tends, depending on who's speaking and how things go, to be mellowed or even watered down as the formal agenda begins to take shape and then working documents are drafted. On the one hand, I believe that what we have in that PSMD offers us a good and challenging glimpse into the experience, hopes, dreams, and concerns of young women and men today. They, at the request of Pope Francis, presented these concerns to the bishops of the world in a respectful and a direct manner. It is now up to the bishops and the voting members of the synod to address not only what is in the Instrumentum Laboris, but the other joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties raised by the young people elsewhere. Even if they don't, and we'll see in the coming weeks, even if they don't address this, we are partners in the mentoring, spiritual companioning, and empowering of young people for ministry in the church today. And as such, while we are not participants in the synod, we can and we should reflect on how to incorporate these signs of our times that the young people are identifying into our ministries and into our institutions. And to that effect, I'm going to propose these 3 questions for this afternoon. The first is, what are some of the most pressing concerns that the international gathering of young adults have presented to the synod that affect the young adults you work with? How do we address the, quote, controversial issues that remain a challenge for church leaders to acknowledge, to respond to, and incorporate into their teaching and pastoral ministry? And what do vocation and discernment mean to you? What does that mean to me? How do we understand, discuss, and mentor young people around these important themes in our ministry or in our institution? Thank you.